Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the John Hay Library. My name is Amanda Strauss, and I'm the Associate University Librarian for Special Collections and the Director of the Hay, and it is such a pleasure to have you today. You're actually in our lounge room that contains our History of Science, part of our really large History of Science collections, so I hope that this event also encourages you to come back and do research at the Hay, maybe mine our collections for some of your own future work. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce my friend and our speaker today, Maia Weinstock, who's author of Carbon Queen, The Remarkable Life of Nanoscience Pioneer Mildred Dresselhaus, which is hot off of MIT Press this year. Maia graduated from Brown in 1999 with a concentration in human biology, focusing on the evolution of gender, which is fascinating. She is an award-winning member of the Chatterlocks, an a cappella group, a sports writer, and a photo editor with the Brown Daily Herald, and she was also a member of the varsity squash team. I didn't know all this about you, Maia. It's quite fabulous. Maia is an editor, writer, and producer of science, academic, and children's media. As the deputy editorial director at MIT News, she is currently the deputy editorial director at MIT News, and she previously served as the editorial director at Brain Pop and as a staff member at DiscoverSpace.com, Aviation Week and Space Technology, and Scholastic's Science World. Maia writes often on the history of women in STEM and on diversity in STEM media. She is, and this may be one of my favorite parts about Maia, internationally known for her custom Lego projects, including Women of NASA, which is a Lego Ideas winning and Amazon best-selling toy, and Women of Computing, a Lego finalist. Maia has also been an MIT lecturer on the history of women in STEM and led efforts to increase the participation and representation of women in Wikipedia, which is work that brought us together probably 10 years ago. So today, Maia will present on the life and work of the extraordinary physicist and electrical engineer and material scientist Millie Dresselhaus, 1930 to 2017. As a girl in New York City in the 1940s, Dresselhaus was taught that there were only 3 career options open to women: secretary, nurse, or teacher. And she sounds like a woman after my own heart. She was sneaking into museums and purchasing 3-cent copies of National Geographic, and of course, devouring books on the history of science, like we have here at the John Hay Library, and that ignited her passion for inquiry. She defied expectations and forged a career in solid-state physics, making highly influential discoveries about the properties of carbon and other materials. In doing so, she helped reshape our world in countless ways, from electronics to aviation to medicine to energy. And she was a path-breaking role model. And now, thanks to Maia's research, we can all learn more about this wonderful woman. So Maia, without further ado, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It is really wonderful to be back here at Brown. Thank you, everybody, for being here today on a gorgeous afternoon. It is also a pleasure to be here on Ada Lovelace Day, which, if you don't know, is a day that since 2009 has celebrated women in technology and then has expanded to all of the STEM fields. So it started out as a program to have everybody blog about their favorite scientist or someone that they knew who was underappreciated. And it has since grown into a worldwide event in which we can pause for a moment and take stock of some of the fantastic achievements of women in these fields, especially, when they've been overlooked or underappreciated in history. So I think it's very appropriate that we can meet here today and talk about the wonderful career of Millie Dresselhaus. So I am going to talk to you today about this one amazing woman. I got to know her mostly after she had passed away, which happened in 2017. But I did get to meet her once, and I will talk a little bit more about that toward the end of my talk. When I joined the MIT staff, I've been at MIT since 2014, Millie was someone whose name kind of reverberated in the hallowed halls of the Institute. She's someone who sort of had a legend about her, and I was really curious to learn little bits about her as my work in the news office collided with her career. I was initially introduced to her because she had been named by Discover magazine, which I was working at the time, as one of the 50 most important women in science of 2002. So that's 20 years ago this year. So I had actually initially emailed her at some point and just fact-checked our information about her, and never could have conceived having written an entire book about her, but here we are, and I'm very glad that that has occurred. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Millie, and I'll just say that everyone called her Millie, even though her birth name was Mildred, but even some of her children would call her Millie. So it is a term of endearment and also of respect, just because everyone around science and engineering spoke to her as Millie. So this photo you can see here is President Barack Obama giving Millie the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I believe it was in 2015. It might have been 2014. No, it was 2014, because it was just a couple of days after I met her, actually. So this was one of the highest honors that she received, and it was for a lifetime of achievement in both her field of solid-state physics, in which she made many foundational discoveries about the properties of carbon and other semi-metals, but also she made great strides in expanding the participation of women and other underrepresented groups in STEM, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. On the right here are some of the forms or allotropes of carbon, only some of which were really known to science. In fact, really only 2 were known to science, as far as I understand, excuse me, when Millie began her career in 1960. On the top layer, A and B represent diamond, which is, of course, made of pure carbon, and B is graphite, which is these sheets of carbon atoms that are arranged in rings. The bonds between the carbon atoms and graphene are extremely strong, so the individual planes are very, tough, but in between the planes, the bonds are relatively weak, and so that's what makes it easy to, for example, write with a pencil. You're getting the carbon graphite onto the page just by slipping it onto, pressing onto the page. Some of these other allotropes are molecules or forms that she helped discover in one way or another. For example, we have, in D is an image of a carbon buckyball or Buckminster fullerene, and letter G is a carbon nanotube. She spent a lot of time on both of these forms, as well as graphite. And if I misspoke before, graphene is basically the individual layers, but graphite is the composite. So graphite is what is inside a pencil, and then the individual layers compose them, and that is, each one is known as graphene. So anyway, she played an outstanding role in helping to determine the electronic properties and other thermal properties and many other properties of these kinds of materials, and with them, many applications have flowed out, many of which are in our world every day today, and you probably don't even recognize it. Probably within this laptop are carbon nanotubes helping with sensors. There are structural carbon nanotubes that are used. There are certain graphene applications that are only now just being developed. And as you'll see later in my talk, the number of applications has skyrocketed since her career, especially since, I would say, the 80s, and certainly since the early 2000s. I wanted to start the talk also just by briefly noting, I actually went back last night to just double check this enormous timeline that one of her granddaughters compiled shortly after her passing of all of her many and varied events that she took part in, including speeches. And I found that she did speak at Brown twice, at least, probably more, but certainly on the books. She gave 2 talks, one in 1982 on intercalated graphite. So basically, and we'll talk about more what this is, but essentially adding other materials to graphite to see what would happen to both the graphite and to see which materials might work best in these situations and what applications might come out of that. And then in 1997, which was actually when I was here on campus, too bad I didn't know about it at the time, she gave a lecture on carbon nanotubes. So it's possible that we could have been walking across the main green together and not even known it, and then later connected. Okay, so Mildred Spivak was born in 1930 in Brooklyn, New York. Her family was extremely poor. They were immigrants from essentially Poland. Some of the demographics and the geographics have changed since the time when they came over. But they came to New York City at a time which was very difficult for immigrants to get settled, just because it was the Great Depression. And her family struggled to put food on the table. Her mom ended up becoming the breadwinner for much of her childhood because her father struggled with the fact that he lost almost his entire family to the Holocaust. And so that was an early lesson for Millie in basically pulling up your bootstraps and making life work, no matter what your challenges are. She, at the left, the picture here is her middle school photo. This is, I believe, her her official middle school, which was in the Bronx, actually. Her family ended up moving to the Bronx when she was just a few years old, and her neighborhood was a difficult neighborhood. There was a fair amount of gang activity at the time, and it was just overall kind of a dangerous place to be. And her schools were not especially supportive in terms of being able to provide a great educational foundation. And so she was able to, however, move past these difficult circumstances, and both her brother and her were offered free scholarship to a music school in Manhattan. And through this music school, both of them playing violin, that really opened up her eyes to opportunities, not only in terms of academics, but also she learned about many cultural things. She used to write movie reviews. The school would pay for her way to go see movies around New York City. And she would love to do this, and then she would write about it, and then it would be in like the school newspaper or the music school's newspaper. And she also through this learned about ways to, really start to take academics seriously and find a way to potentially get out of the neighborhood she was in and really like be a little bit more global in her future. And she learned about the magnet schools that New York City had at the time, and they still have, but at the time they were mostly only open to boys. There was one strong magnet school that was open to girls at the time, and it was the Hunter College High School. But there you had to pass a rigorous exam to get in. And her middle school teachers were like, well, we don't teach any of that stuff, so good luck getting in, basically. So she said, well, I'm interested in doing this anyway. This is education looks to be an avenue kind of out into the world for me. And so she checked out books out of the New York Public Libraries, and she learned the material to get into Hunter College High School, and she actually aced the entrance exam. So she did end up going to Hunter High, and she had a wonderful time of it. She was a little bit of a fish out of water because many of the people in that system had gone to like feeder schools, but she had come from sort of the public schools. But she managed to transform and take every possible college elective. She became really well known for being a math tutor or any kind of tutor. She would tutor anyone, and that actually brought in a lot of income to her family, and she relied on that to help her family stay afloat. So this is her yearbook photo. Any equation she can solve, any problem she can resolve. Mildred equals brains plus fun in math and science. She's second to none. So this really presaged her ultimate career, and it really was a true story. I'm going to fast forward a little just because of time, but Millie's time at Hunter College was colored most significantly by the woman who would become one of her life's mentors, the person at left here, who is Rosalind Yalow. She is a Nobel Prize winning medical physicist, and I think she's here on my shirt somewhere. Someone put together this shirt of women in science probably 7 or 8 years ago, Millie's not on it, but I think Rosalind's on here somewhere. And she was an adjunct professor at Hunter at the time, kind of treading water, trying to find a career for herself in research. And Millie just crossed her path. And when they met, it was like love at first sight, she said, in terms of like a mentor relationship. And, you know, Rosalind really took Millie under her wing and encouraged her to go into research. And she said, look, this is something that you can do, and you might face some, some harassment, basically, as a woman, or some discrimination, but you can still do it, and to please stick to it because you have the goods. Like, you are, whip smart, and clearly you have what it takes to become a scientist. And again, this is a time when even Rosalind herself was having a hard time finding a research career. This was after the war, and she couldn't find a steady job doing research. She had two strikes against her. She was Jewish and she was a woman, and so Millie faced the same issues. But the fact is, she really turned Millie's life around and encouraged her to the point where she, Millie took her advice and went on to the next level, which is to try to find fellowships and then go on to graduate school. So right here is a photo of Enrico Fermi, who is another of Millie's great mentors in life. As many of you know, Professor Fermi was Enrico was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist even at the time that he had met Millie. They overlapped for only 1 year at the University of Chicago when Millie was a grad student. And at that time, she had taken a fellowship at the University of Cambridge, and had decided that physics was going to be her area of specialty, even though earlier she wasn't sure she would go into math, into chemistry. But she decided to go into physics, and when she ultimately went to the University of Chicago, she would actually walk with Enrico Fermi to class. They shared the same route to school, and he would invite her to speak with him and to chat with him, and which was, something very unusual, she said, in terms of her other professors, many of whom didn't even want to give her the time of day and felt that she was unwelcome as a woman in science at that time. So she really not only helped shape the fact that he was so welcoming of her, and also just generally of young people, male or female. But she also took classes with him on mechanics and all sorts of science at that time. And she had said many times over her career that he helped her to learn how to think like a physicist. And as I researched my book, I came to hear so many instances where she referenced her connection with Fermi and some of the things that he told her about becoming a specialist in the sense of, becoming a generalist in the sense of knowing your specialty area very well, but also having a broad overview of, whether it's physics, whether it's chemistry, so that if you ever have some kind of career change or something will necessitate a shift or, a move to another direction, that you will have a firm, solid foundation from which to start. And she used that a number of times when she had to, make course corrections in her career. Let's see. So this is showing Millie's second husband, actually. She was married briefly to a physicist named Fred Rife. They I don't actually know exactly how long they were married, but it was relatively brief. And in graduate school, she met her future long-term husband, Gene Dresselhaus, who was also a theoretical physicist in solid-state physics. And it was a match that lasted throughout the rest of their lives. They married in 1958, right when she finished up her PhD program. He went on to a professorship at Cornell, and she took a postdoc through the NSF, also at Cornell. That was going to be sort of the beginning of their career. And during that time, they also started their family. They ultimately had 4 kids. This is a picture of Millie with her first child, a daughter, Marianne. It's actually their only daughter. And Marianne has said that she, doesn't remember being in the lab, but that her mom would take her to the lab, and here's a picture of her at Cornell. I can't really tell what she's doing there, but Millie brought her in. There's another story in my book from another, her later boss at MIT, Lincoln Lab, who had, been shown one day that Millie had brought one of her other babies in, and he really appreciated that family atmosphere that she brought. And she was, a very serious worker, a very serious scientist, but at the same time, there was no daycare, there was no childcare centers and colleges at that time. And that was definitely a difficulty, especially for Millie when she had 4 kids right in a row, pretty much. So she did what she needed to do, and thankfully she had an extremely supportive husband, and also she had a nanny who worked for their family for like 30 years. And I will mention that one of her sons told me that, Millie said that when she was first starting out, she actually paid the nanny more than she was making as a scientist, and that this, she knew that this was a sort of a down payment on her career, and that she was making an investment in her later career. And I think many of us know who have kids, it is very expensive to have daycare these days. At least we usually have the option, especially if you're in a university setting, but it's still extremely expensive. So, that is something that has not changed in the 50-some years since this photo. So, briefly, Millie basically faced a little bit of a discrimination when she was at Cornell. She was discouraged from basically having anything to do with engineering students that she was working with, physicists there. So she didn't accomplish a whole lot, and after, and not of her own fault, she published a couple of papers, but the person that she had originally come to work with left right after she got there, and so she lost her support there, aside from her husband, of course. And so she and her husband basically had to decide whether they would stay there, because once her postdoc funding was up, she knew that she wasn't going to have a job. There was no way for her to actually work at Cornell. And she even offered to do physics for free, and they said, no, sorry, we need you to move on. So ultimately, her husband, Gene, made a huge critical decision that, I applaud him for, and many people do, which is he left his faculty position at Cornell so that they could find some place where they could work together. And so they had 2 competing offers. One was from IBM Research, and the other was from MIT's Lincoln Laboratory, which is a federally funded research center up in there's a few towns that come together, so Lexington, Bedford, that area. And this is actually still her at Cornell, but shortly after she joined the staff at Lincoln Lab, she started working on carbon at the suggestion of her husband, who had done some work on carbon prior, but had not delved deep into it. Now, the question of why did she pick carbon, there are a couple of major reasons. One is that at the time, the carbon system was considered too difficult to really understand. And many people at the time, especially many of her colleagues at Lincoln, were working on semiconducting materials, which of course were being seen as sort of the wave of the future for electronic machinery. Carbon was not considered, and she looked into semiconductors, but she wasn't particularly excited about them, and she felt that one semiconductor had very similar physics to the other, and that, carbon would be an interesting challenge because, for one thing, as I said, people thought it was kind of a labyrinthine system and very difficult to parse anything interesting out of. The other reason is that since nobody else was focused on carbon at the time, or extremely few people were, she had less competition, and any discoveries that she might make would give her a little bit of an advantage to be a leader in that field, which is something interesting to learn for later on in your career. And then thirdly, of course, she was, the mom to 4 very small children at the time, and taking on a research subject such as carbon at that time would afford her an opportunity not to worry so much if, for example, she had a sick kid or had to take a day where she had to, deal with her children instead of, focusing 100% on her work. But she made a number of really interesting discoveries regardless with carbon. And one of the first areas she worked on is something called carbon graphite intercalation compounds. And that's what I was mentioning before, which is you take other materials and intersperse them in between the layers of graphite. So today this sounds like fairly quaint, but back in the day, there was no way of isolating graphene layers from graphite. This was really the only way you could study the individual layers, was to kind of jimmy them apart by mixing them together with other materials. So this really did set the foundation for a lot of the science that is currently happening in terms of graphene science. And many of the experiments that she and Jean did at Lincoln were later repeated once graphene was isolated later in the early 2000s. Okay. So I'll just mention also in terms of her transition to MIT. So MIT oversees Lincoln Laboratory, but is separate from the MIT campus. At a certain point, in about 7 years into her tenure at Lincoln, she faced another issue, again with the child care situation, which was that she was getting harassed for not coming in right at 8 a.m. And even though, her husband would come in with her at the same time, and he wouldn't get harassed for being late, but she would, even though she was putting in plenty of time and coming out with really interesting work. So at a certain point, she felt stuck, and somebody who had transitioned to the MIT faculty suggested, well, maybe you could be a visiting professor in the electrical engineering department. So that is what happened. She took on a visiting professorship that immediately translated to a full-time full professorship with tenure. So she got to skip the entire tenure track, which is pretty amazing. It speaks volumes to how well she had been doing in terms of her research. She had been coming to MIT to work with the Magnet Lab, which had not yet been transitioned to a national facility, but was on his way to doing that. And so she had already made some really interesting discoveries, for example, related to the placement of electrons and holes, which are sort of the positive counterpart to electrons in the structure of carbon. That was a big discovery that really literally turned around all the papers that had been published to that point, and sort of solidified her as a key researcher in this area. On the right, she was one of the first people to be in the field of carbon science, really. This particular presentation or conference took place in Japan, and it was the 1970 Japan-USA seminar on the new materials science of carbon and graphite. So, as you can see, she's I love this picture. There's a number, I think there might be like a Tumblr or something of like the only women in a picture of all men, especially with regard to academics. So here's the Millie version. I'll also just mention that at this conference, Millie was someone who was very internationally focused her whole career. She was someone who was very happy to work with people in different countries of different nationalities, and in some cases she helped to develop solid-state science programs, solid-state physics programs in the countries. So like, for instance, Brazil has a program that she really started by herself, essentially, her and Jean. So she, was someone who worked very closely with people throughout her career that were just around the world. Like, she was not very focused on, New England or the United States even. So just briefly, I'll give you a little bit of a sampling of some of her greatest hits in terms of what she's known for discovering and influencing. On the left here is a influential graph that shows the discovery or pre-discovery of the Buckminster fullerene, which is the molecule here on the right. So Buckminster fullerene was a concept that had been thought of, but nobody really understood whether buckyballs might exist for real in nature. And she and some of her colleagues were bombarding carbon samples with laser light and finding that all this stuff was coming off of it, and nobody really knew what was going on. Her clothes would get all black, And she had basically discovered that there were relatively large molecules, and nobody really understood what they were, or how many atoms there might be, or what they might look like. And she was at a conference or at a talk with some researchers from the research arm of Exxon, who were looking at carbon clusters as well. And she had implored them through her discoveries to look at carbon clusters that were relatively large. Mostly everybody had been looking at really small ones and not really finding anything interesting. And she was saying, based on our research, you should look at carbon clusters that are up to, let's say, 100 atoms large. And so this is the relatively well-known chart that came out of that work, that came out of her suggestion. And you can see at the 60 mark and also at the 70 mark are signals for essentially carbon-60, which is the Buckminster fullerene, and then C70 is a slightly elongated version. Now, at the time, this particular graph is not like, it's not like 100% of a home run. You can still, there's like the lower cluster numbers are there, and then it's not like 60 is like so much out of the way of the others. So there was still a little bit of uncertainty as to what they were looking at, but this particular work, led to further experiments and further research that did ultimately lead to the discovery of the buckyball. Now, I'll just say that buckyballs have been relatively they have not found as many applications as had originally been hoped. As far as I know, there are some limited applications in medicine, but for the most part, the importance of buckyballs is that they ultimately led to the discovery of carbon nanotubes, which have had many applications. So essentially, a carbon nanotube is an elongated version of a buckyball that just, doesn't have the caps on the end. But the electronic properties of them and other properties, thermal, whatever, properties of them, are very important and very interesting and very applicable to many different things. So this is an area that, occupied Millie's time and interest for decades, at least a couple of decades. And just briefly, I won't go through each one of these. One of Millie's key contributions in terms of carbon nanotubes and their import is she and her colleagues discovered that depending on the placement of the atoms and the configuration of them in the nanotube, it would actually change the properties. And so doing that, you can actually tune whatever it is you want to use out of the nanotubes, and then they can have different applications for different things that you might want. So speaking of some of those applications, as I said, there are just many of them. Medical sensors detecting DNA, for instance. Plastic additives have carbon nanotubes in them. You can find them in anti-corrosion coatings, all sorts of things. Batteries, chip memory. Sporting equipment is one, certainly reinforced concrete. The list really goes on, and they're in it's an area that you don't really think about. And so that's one of the reasons I think Millie has not gotten as much of a worldwide name as some people who might study, let's say, astronomy, or who discovered like the top quark or something, because, material science is one that maybe is a little bit less sexy because we use it every day, and we don't always think about like what actually goes into the computing machines that we use and so on. So on the bottom, these are an image of at left a carbon nanotube forest, which was created, and then at right is actually a carbon nanotube yarn, which is sort of like, if you could see the forest over here, and then they just basically pull the pieces of the nanotubes and spin it together to make an extremely strong and extremely lightweight material that is, one of the strongest that you can have from nature, essentially. So I was talking earlier about how her work essentially has had such an influence in terms of like the number of publications that have gone up and up and up since her career began. So her career began in 1960 And so this is just starting from 1990, but she was definitely in on the ground floor even at 1990. But since then, the number of, and the x-axis is number of publications, number of mentions of the terms fullerenes, which is buckyballs, carbon nanotubes, and graphene. And, obviously, as I said, fullerenes have had relatively limited applications and they've sort of petered off. Carbon nanotubes have certainly still gone up and they're still going up, but graphene, which was first isolated in 2004 and 5, a couple of papers were the first, and those were Nobel Prize winning papers. Interest in that has gone through the roof. And, actually, Millie played a significant role in influencing the people the two men who did win that Nobel Prize in 2010, to the point where they both mentioned her in their Nobel speech, and one of them actually invited her to come to the Nobel talk. So she never herself won a Nobel Prize, but she was hugely influential on the field, and she gave ideas out like they were candy. Like, she constantly was giving people, PhD theses ideas or just your next research topic. She also played an important role in the administration of science and the development of, she worked, for instance, on the left, she was being sworn in here as the head of the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Science, which was a cabinet level position that had to be confirmed. Not cabinet level, but you know what I'm saying, it has to actually be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And so on the right, you can see here she was actually touring Fermilab, and in the book I give a quote. There was a newsletter that I found where somebody, I guess a postdoc or a staff researcher, had said that she had come in and made everybody feel like, it was like group therapy talking to her, and she was very jazzed to go to work the next day because she just, she made no pretense about the fact that, like, okay, yep, we might have to tighten our belts for budget reasons, but you guys have an opportunity to change the world and make the world a better place, and all this like very inspirational stuff. And she did that both internationally, especially in the United States. Of course, at MIT, she did it in many of the classes she taught. She had, I think, about 60 PhD students and many other researchers that were visiting under her watch. She also was, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, a big champion of women in the STEM fields. These are just a handful of the people who were highly influenced by her work. We have, for instance, Deborah Chung, who was her first PhD student, who is now a highly regarded professor at the University of Buffalo, and she discovered something called smart concrete, which uses carbon nanofibers to basically have concrete that can sense things like strain, and that's directly working with Millie. Shirley Ann Jackson is the recently retired, very accomplished former president of RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, who also worked in government. She also worked in industry. The young woman on the bottom right is someone who had a little bit more limited connection with Millie, but she encouraged her to start a program that encourages underrepresented individuals in STEM fields in her native country. And, it's just many examples of people that Millie would come across in her life and really set on a new direction and give, a pat on the back, make phone calls, make emails, make faxes for them, and really help them become the scientists that she knew that they could be. Oh, and just briefly, on the right is one of her former postdocs, I believe, mapped out all of her research collaborators she had 1,700 papers that she co-authored and 8 books. And he made this incredible map. It's almost like you can't even really see all of the connections, but it just gives you a general sense of just how influential she was and how her sphere was actually so broad. Only a few of the people on here are from MIT. And the bigger the name, the more connections she had in terms of co-authorships. But most of her collaborators were actually not at MIT. So. And then coming towards the end here, Millie, was highly feted with honors, awards throughout her career. She was the very many firsts at MIT, but also she was, many firsts in other ways. First woman to do X, Y, or Z, whether it was be the first female president of, the American Physical Society, or just so many other firsts. And but also, of course, she had just a wonderful research career that, she never ultimately won a Nobel Prize, but this is her winning the Kavli Prize, which is very similar in terms of stature. It's given by Norway instead of Sweden. It's really capped a career of love of research and inquiry into physics and materials science. And then lastly, this is my one time that I met Millie. Again, it was in 2014. It was like early November. It was just a few days before she met Barack Obama for her Medal of Freedom. And, I make these minifigures of scientists and engineers. And I had known that I wanted to give the one that I had made of her to her. And she emailed me right away and said, I don't know if you know this, but your picture of my Lego of the Lego is on my bulletin board, and people talk about it all the time. So I was kind of flattered that she even knew who I was. So she was really wonderful. I got to speak to her for about half an hour, and we talked about both being from New York and both having connections in, interested in women in science. And I knew that when I wrote the book, I wanted to sort of update the minifigure, and so we made these little minifigs here. So so it's, Millie's story is one that's just extremely inspiring. She came from such a difficult background, and she just, had a persistence about her that, she was one of those people that could make lemonade out of any number of lemons thrown her way. So she was someone who was very easy to get behind, and really spend about four years of my life reading about her. So anyway, that is my story of Millie Dresselhaus. I hope you are inspired by her, and thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. If anybody has a question, happy to take any. Yep.
So given all the discrimination she had in her girls, how the heck did she manage to get a tenured job without
Right.
going through tenure?
I know. It was really incredible. I mean, I think my sense is at the time she was such a highly regarded researcher already, even though she'd only been 7 years at Lincoln Lab. She'd made some really profound discoveries, even at the early part of her career. And she had already started working with, some students on MIT campus. And I get the sense that, MIT was still grappling with how they wanted to treat women in terms of being students, being professors. There were extremely few women on the faculty when she joined, and even into, the 70s. And MIT actually was one of the first universities to admit women. I mean, their earliest student was, she was considered an experimental student, but Ellen Swallow Richards was, a student back in, the 1800s. But MIT was very haphazard in terms of how their policies towards admitting women. And I think at the time that Millie joined the faculty, they were finally starting to rethink and really put a little bit more emphasis on encouraging women to be students and ultimately to be faculty members. Among other things, they finally put the money towards building a women's dorm. Previous to 1963, they didn't have any place for women to be, and so the number of women who could be accepted at MIT was literally limited by their very, very little space for them in dorms. So I get the sense that, they could see very clearly that she was a fantastic educator and researcher, and they were just willing to put a bet on her career, and they clearly bet well. She spent almost 50 years at MIT, almost 60 at MIT, including Lincoln Lab. And she, was the first woman to be the MIT Institute professor. She was really beloved, and I think that came across very quickly. So it is unheard of today, and I mentioned that in the book. So kudos to her. Hi.
I'm so curious about your research process. Was it mainly interviews? Did you have archival materials you looked at? How did you pull all this together?
A little of both, but I will say that Millie gave interviews her entire life, and so I benefited from a huge collection of just, there were online interviews going back to, I don't know what the earliest online thing was, but, her family helped out with some archival materials. There was a Cosmopolitan article from 1976 that, just was like one of the first articles that she gave an interview for. And so, honestly, I was able to collect so many interviews and go through every one that clearly there were themes that came up throughout her career. And, some of the things that she talked about, I was able to just conclude that those were the most important things to her in her career. And of course, I did talk to other people as well. I talked certainly to her family, but also to others who had connections with her throughout her career at MIT and elsewhere. The MIT archives had wonderful materials as well. They actually have a lot more now. She had only just passed away when I was starting the book, so she did bequeath her papers, but they were not available to me. So one day I will go in there and look at what else I could have written about. But yeah, no, definitely there were some really early oral histories, many oral histories she's done. Honestly, many days I was watching interviews that she gave on YouTube, and it was a little spooky because, of course, she had passed away, but, I was trying to sort of channel her in many ways. And, the fact that you can so easily call up her interviews and her talks online really helped and really kind of kept the interest in the subject and just, the freshness of it with me, especially as, you go through slog periods where it's tough, but yeah. And I actually did go to the Schlesinger Library for it. So I knew Amanda through a program at the Schlesinger at Harvard, and the woman who ran the music school that she went to as a child, I think some of her papers are there. And so I was looking to see if there was anything of interest that might talk about her time there. And specifically, Millie actually met and played violin for Eleanor Roosevelt, which is one of the events that was seared in her memory, and she was always a lifelong fan of Mrs. Roosevelt. And so I did go to the Schlesinger. I unfortunately wasn't able to find too much about it, but yeah. Appreciate archives for sure. Anything else? Yeah.
Your Instagram, whatever, Twitter, whatever. What's the Tory?
Oh, 20 Tauri. Sure. So 20 Tauri is actually the star name of the star Maia in the constellation. It's the star cluster of the Pleiades. So my name is spelled Maia, and it's relatively rare. 20 Tauri is the number of the star Maia in the Pleiades. Yeah. Now you know. Well, thank you everybody for being here. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed her story, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this beautiful day.